And welcome to another Underrated Film Saturday, and today I'm going to be discussing a film that I think originally did receive for popularity and recognition, but I think has kind of gone by the wayside over the years, and hasn't had a lot of, I think, people really talking about it all too much. And that film is 127 Hours. Now, I find this film fascinating because I like comparing and contrasting it to a film that is a little bit similar to it, Into the Wild. I personally prefer this film over Into the Wild, only because I think the messages come off a lot clearer, and I think there's more of a balanced interpretation, and it's less kind of one-sided. As far as a survival kind of a survival slash adventure film out into the wilderness story is concerned. But basically, um, what is similar to these two films is the fact that we have two very adventurous, kind of lust for life kind of characters. James Frank, the main character in 127 Hours, played by James Franco, I believe his name is Aron Ralston. He is a very out there kind of guy. He doesn't really, he's not really good at following up with people. He kind of likes the isolation, and he also likes to be adventurous and take risks, similar to the main character in Into the Wild. Also, the interesting thing too is that these two stories are actually based on true stories. These are actual people who actually went through these kinds of circumstances. So that's, I think, another important thing to note, which is, again, something that you don't really see in a lot of films, at least nowadays. But there is distinct and important differences. In 127 Hours, it's a lot more about survival than, like I mentioned before, with Into the Wild being very escapist. What I mean by that is that you see the main character in 127 Hours trying to return to his normal life, because he ends up in really dire circumstances. Whereas the character in Into the Wild just kind of goes to die. He's like, I'm just gonna go. I'm just gonna leave everything behind, and and you can kind of understand though why he ends up doing it, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that he doesn't have a very stable family background, who withheld secrets from him and all this other stuff. So you could understand why he would abandon the thing that's supposed to really be the most closest to him. Don't agree with it. Don't agree a lot with Into the Wild guy, but still. And does Aron kind of make stupid mistakes too within this movie, kind of like the character in Into the Wild? Yes. They do try to emphasize that there is a certain level of stupidity when you are trying to isolate yourself from people. And unfortunately, in 127 Hours, it gets to the best of Aron because he ends up basically being trapped under a boulder after sort of, I guess they call it canyoneering in Utah. So basically, his arm gets stuck in a boulder. And those 127 hours are basically the time he's trying to figure out how the heck he can get out and stay alive. And you see how he eventually becomes more desperate. There's like this, you really do, the film, what I think really does a good job is really showing you the isolation aspect of it. There's at one point where his character sees like a plane, but it's so far away, like they wouldn't be able to hear him or be able to help him at all. And then they show you kind of images of like people just going about their everyday lives, and him just being kind of this guy in the middle of nowhere. And I think that really shows the really great contrast of isolation versus city life where there's massive amounts of people. Um, and I think there is kind of an understanding that people have as to why Aaron would kind of want to escape, because you can tell he's the kind of character who really enjoys the wildlife, and or at least the natural wild, basically. He really likes the canyons, and they really show you these very majestic shots of nature and all of that. But it shows you also the consequences, and how sometimes nature can be a force against you, and like the boulder who goes on his arm. Um, the interesting thing too is he actually records um, his whole ordeal, basically, within the film. I think in real life he actually, because I remember hearing this story on the news a while back. I almost want to say he did do some actual recordings of him uh, kind of having this experience of having a boulder on him. Um, and I believe those are actually uploaded probably somewhere on YouTube as well. But it is rather interesting because he is trying to kind of, the video thing is like it's trying to engage. It's trying to fulfill that loneliness that he has and that fear of death that he has. It's kind of like a distraction, I think, for him. And you really do feel something really for his character. And I think he does showcase a certain amount of guilt. He does have a lot of regrets about certain things. And I liked that they didn't sugarcoat that. And that's what kind of bothered me about Into the Wild as an underrated film, because although it has some great aspects to it, what did bother me is the lack of balance and how they made the main character of Into the Wild like some kind of hippie hero, and I didn't really like that whole approach. But here it's completely balanced, and you see, how these things really do have an impact, and taking certain risks are probably not worth it. Um, but like the adventurers of the world, and uh, like uh, the circumstances they end up being in, they sort of like those circumstances, to sort of find a way to get out of them. Basically, it's on the one hand, Aaron goes to escape, but on the other hand, he learns that it's not important. It's important to not isolate yourself, and it's definitely best to try to think a little bit smarter when it comes to these circumstances. And that's what I think really the film was trying to be about. It was trying to show you a balanced approach of being in the wild and being within nature, and also the other side of not shunning away people, because the time you might need them most, they may not be there for you, and you'll have to find your own way out of something. And at the same time, that's going to lead to a lot of consequences and um, a lot of sacrifices, which you do see Aaron sort of make within the film, and you will see those things if you choose to watch it. So it is very intense, because on the one hand, you might be thinking that somebody talking into their camera for 2 hours is not that engaging. But for me personally, it it was an interesting approach, and I think it ultimately works for the film, because this the story is actually, I think, quite fascinating. Um, despite despite the main character's lack of foresight, I totally can sort of see how some people really do get carried away with their environment, and that it's something that ends up ultimately haunting them. But at the same time, they it and the story is as much about survival as well as self sort of reflection, because you really do see Aaron sort of reflect onto his life. Um, and so I think that's also very important to note. Um, so I think it was rather balanced in that way, and that's why I felt that as a film, as far as plot and character development was concerned, I think it suited itself better. Um, and I think it is one of those films that I think gets overlooked only because, you know, you're in such a limited space for this length of time. But I think if you're like in the mood and you want to uh, have this kind of a survival like angle to it, I think this is definitely one to go to, because there's rarely any survival films out there that really do convey this balance, I think, rather well, of of a main character realizing his naivete while also looking into um, ways in which to survive from such lack of foresight. So I think that's really ultimately at the heart of this film, and I think really works. But I think that's really ultimately all I can say about without giving too much away. Again, you're in this very kind of claustrophobic environment, only because again he's in a canyon with Boulder on his arm. So you're going to be limited on that, but there is a lot of intensity. There's a lot of, I think, emotion, um, and one part you probably want to look away if you don't like blood. But that's basically all I can say about without giving too much away. But yeah, if there are any questions, comments, concerns, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Again, if you're not into the whole kind of survival kind of thing, or if you don't if you don't appreciate being with one particular character for a significant amount of time, this might not be for you. But it kind of just depends on if you can kind of accept certain things that sort of are basically a part of the film. I find it to be rather enjoyable, but I understand if it's maybe not some other people's cup of tea. But yeah, that's I think all I can say. But thank you so much for watching. Hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year. And I hope to see you on the next video. Take care. Bye bye.